This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest is joining me remotely in a pandemic-era episode of the podcast from Milo, Maine. Welcome to the podcast, Noah Bissell.
Thanks for having me, man. Been long-time listener, first-time guest.
Noah also has his own podcast, and so just by a serendipitous reach out and connection this week, we were able to get something on the schedule. Obviously, I've been a fan of Bissell Brothers for many, many years. As I mentioned to Noah as we were talking about this, I looked back at my untapped check-ins, and my very first check-in of the Substance IPA was back when it was still clear, and that should date me on this back in 2015. No, and I've been to Maine a number of times over the last few years. Obviously, we've done brewers retreats in Maine. Been to the Bissell Brothers Brew House. We've actually never met in person, but have been a big fan of the beer for a long time. So I'm really excited about this conversation. We're going to absolutely talk about New England style IPAs. Our next issue of the magazine that we're working on right now is the IPA issue. And so I've been wrapped up in drinking IPAs and reviewing IPAs from around the country. Before we start the conversation, nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Innovative modular designs and no proprietary parts propel G&D ahead as the premier choice for your glycol chilling needs. Breweries you recognize like Russian River, Ninkasi, Jack's Abbey, Samuel Adams, and more trust G&D to chill the beer you love. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, Old Orchard invites you to step up your fruit game with their premier craft juice blends. Whether you're planning a passion fruit Kolsch, Concord Sour, mango lager, or other fruity brew, Old Orchard can supply you with consistent product at affordable prices. Their blends are packed with real fruit and natural flavors with no added sugar or other weird fillers you'd find in knockoff brands. With the rising demand for fruity seltzers and brews, the time is ripe to grow your relationship with the right juice supplier. Get your Old Orchard sample kit today with free 6-pack cooler at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. So Noah.
Yes.
Talk to me about your history in brewing and how you got where you are today as co-founder of Bissell Brothers in Portland, Maine.
Yeah, absolutely. Real quick, I just want to say I've been waiting to do this for as long as I've been listening to the podcast. Big fan of G&D Chillers. Yeah, have two in Portland and one up here. So
nice.
Yeah. Shout out.
They're great folks, people. And we appreciate their support. They've been fantastic supporters of the podcast now for a couple of years. So
cool. I started home brewing in the summer between my sophomore and junior year of college. I had about 6 months to go before I would be 21. Was staying with my brother in Portland for the summer, and there was a homebrew store a couple blocks away, so pretty quick math for someone in my predicament, and just decided to, I'll just make my own, and as most homebrewers find out, like, it ain't the same. It ain't the same for a while, but was definitely bit by as soon as I smelled the, wort boiling for the first time, pretty much, I was hooked on home brewing and rode that really hard through the next full year of college. And then at kind of entering senior year, my brother, who was doing commercial photography at the time, self-employed, was kind of bitten by the entrepreneurial bug in terms of just kind of creating the work life you want to exist in, not the other way around. He always gives me credit for proposing the idea that we open a brewery together. I do not remember that exact. I really think it was just sort of an organic thing, and one of those things where you kind of look at each other and it just you're both kind of thinking the same thing. So that was right around the end of 2011 that we kind of handshake agreement, like let's go for this. So finished out college, and then about pretty much 2 years to the day almost from that kind of, all right, let's have a go at this moment is when we sold our first batch of commercial beer. We moved into the spot Maine Beer Company was operating at across the street from Allagash, the fabled One Industrial Way.
Sure.
Yeah, they were at the time I was bartending at the Thirsty Pig, which was an amazing kind of transition from kind of foray into the Maine beer scene, and just kind of to have be at kind of almost the ground floor of that in a lot of ways. It's right across the street from Navarre Res too, in Portland's Old Port. But kind of through that, Allison, my boss at the Thirsty Pig, knowing Dan and Dave Kleben, they reached out to us about that. They kind of offered the space to us almost. They weren't landlords or anything, but knew they were moving out, and and I mean, at that moment in my life, it was literally like, if a huge rap fan gets a call from Young Thug, like I was blown away by the fact that he would just, A, the generosity behind that, and B, that he would even think about me as a person on earth wanting to open a brewery. And then from there, that gave us a huge leg up, though, to have a space that was already a brewery, to have their chiller, as installed as it could be in terms of the glycol drops, the G&D chiller, I will say, and boiler already installed. I mean, boiler piping is
sure.
They saved us at least $100,000 from just throwing us that bone. So, and then I'll stop there because that's there's the additional 6 years beyond that's a lot.
For sure. Talk to me about that kind of creative genesis. I mean, the business piece of it is one thing, but you have to, as a brewery, think about what you're going to make and who you're going to serve, because there you are across the street from Allagash. Allagash serves a lot of people, and they make some phenomenal beer, world-class, amazing beer in a number of different kind of avenues. As a small business, you then have to think like, what am I going to make that is going to get people to walk across from the parking lot and come and drink beer here, and how is what I'm going to make going to hold up to what they're drinking across the street?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it, especially from how different everything was back then. The first thing that jumps out at me at that, there was very much this comparison of like, where do we? It's hard to even believe how crowded things felt then, 6 years ago, as someone trying to enter the industry. It just felt like there was this constant mental battle of like, well, I don't have anything to add to this conversation. What are we even doing? Combined with this belief somewhere that you actually did. But
we were so naive back then. I mean, I remember is the bubble, are we at the end of the bubble? Right. Is it about to burst? Like, oh, that's so cute with 1,800 breweries. Now this is the end of it all,
I know.
Right? But talk to me about that process for you of finding yourself and finding that brewing voice for the brewery as a whole.
I think the voice, whether we thought too much about it or not, had kind of already been. We had definitely a leg up on that from just. I had been brewing for the first 9 months of being open, or maybe it was 8, something like that. We only brewed substance on our commercial scale. That was literally it, and that was before literally kind of that concept more or less crystallized home brewing about another 2 years before we even opened in the first place. Obviously, I was homebrewing other beers as well, but pretty much I would brew something like what became substance every week. In addition, then another batch of something else, homebrewing. So I think, and then that coupled with Pete's is why I think make a really great team. Pete's. I sound so old to say this, but savvy for social media and stuff was just at a completely different place and level and under comprehension than mine still is. I mean, it's just a shadow of what his, because he was just kind of living in a more digital world with photography.
Sure.
And just, I think, his natural disposition anyway. So, and kind of people at that time would say it was, kind of cart before the horse, maybe, or whatever, that there was this perception of kind of almost advertising before we had even sold a commercial beer, because of Pete taking a lot of pictures. There was a presence of our brewery before, from just trying to get homebrew, but it was very much it was very natural, it was not and it kind of, as kind of the kind of slightly more behind, especially at that time, more kind of behind the scenes force in the dynamic. It was definitely a motivating factor for me of like, put up or shut up if there is going to be this added level of scrutiny. You better make beer that can hold up to the quality of your Instagram images. Yeah, better Carl Malone that shit and get this delivered. In those terms, and then in terms of going back to the yeast switch, I mean, so by that time we would have brewed, we would have had Swish and Lux, Baby Genius, and Bucolia, pretty much, which is, we kind of revamped, but those would have been kind of the 5 regular beers that we were making, and we still only would have had 4 FVs anyway, so there's not much room beyond that. I think it was just kind of a feeling of, and I had no right to feel that way, but just a growing sense that there was only so much depth we were going to be able to get from being just a single strain brewery for one, but definitely being that single strain being Chico, which has literally been bred and cultured to stay the hell out of the way, and just provide a very very clean canvas for whatever you want to throw on top of it. So I think there was just a sense that long term, knowing that just kind of with how our philosophy's always been, is kind of one variable at a time as much as we can be, is like going back to speaking about tweaking and brewing substance for so long before we even brewed another beer on that scale. Part of that was necessity from just only having 2 or 4 FBs at that time, but NBC had been a really good model, I think, really influential on philosophy for just, if they released beers very infrequently, and if they did, you knew they were going to be really, really good and representative of their brewery. And that's certainly kind of the opposite of culture now, but even then, that was kind of a little bit against the norm for restraint and frequency of different beers. That I've always kind of felt that how different can, I think, really creating an individual identity for a beer. There's only so many identities a beer can have, and I think if you're trying to maintain that at a weekly clip of similar, of beers that kind of would fall under the same umbrella, I mean, that run realistically ends very quickly. But sorry, I got off track on that.
Let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, I think that's an interesting point. I think that does speak to a difference in strategy that you all take.
Well, I do want to be very clear, firstly, that I'm in no way vilifying anyone that doesn't follow this strategy at all. And I completely understand. To kind of the second point, I really don't know if it does work better at all. It's the only way we've decided to go about things. Sure. I'm sure anyone with a financial mind would, looking at the 2 options, would say, make more beers, not more beer per se, but more beers. And that's not to say that we're, martyrs for infrequency or anything like that, but I just think that, I mean, hell, even how unhappy I am with some of our beers now, after having personally brewed, some of them dozens, if not hundreds of times, with my own two hands, and how it's still not really quite what I want, and how that's a lot over time. I don't think you could ever even hope to reach like that hypothetical nirvana zone for any given idea in beer form if you don't really commit to it. But that is very much just me, and that's coming from someone that has never felt even close to like they have gotten to that point. So
that's an interesting point that you just made right there about being unhappy with the beer. And this is a hard one, I think, from a consumer standpoint to wrap your head around, because obviously you're selling beer to a customer and you have to have confidence in that, and you as a creative person are confident in what you produce, that it is good and that people will enjoy it, people want to buy it. But then there's that artist piece that from a creative perspective is always unsettled, that will never actually be happy with what you're doing. Talk to me a little bit about how you manage that, what, in those senses, from a creative brewer perspective, you keep striving to improve in your beers.
It's a tough thing to answer and really be straightforward about, because it is very much a moving target. I mean, I'm sure, anyone listening to this has had the experience of, they had a beer at one time that it was like, practically life-changing, tried again in a few years and it tastes like garbage. And I mean, enough about the brewery to know that there's pretty much no chance that anything about the beer itself is, you are the problem with how this beer's been affected. So, your palate's moving all the time.
Sure.
Towards a better thing, I don't really know. I mean, in logically maybe yes, but I don't know how reliable that train of thought even is. It's almost impossible for me to like have one of our beers and just enjoy it the way a beer is supposed to be enjoyed, and that is in no way playing my little violin at all. It is just a reality that I think a lot of people in the industry kind of share, because they're to that point of always wanting things to be better. And that changes on the day, where your palate is at right in that moment when a beer hits your mouth. It's very hard to just get those thoughts out of the way and just have a beer, for me. So I think it makes that point of like contentment even harder or more unrealistic to hope to reach, because I think there are always going to be things I'm going to want to change, whether they are imagined, real, not there. And that's scary sometimes, but it's also a really cool thing to always have something to shoot at the end of the day, which I think a lot of people in their vocations, they don't quite get to feel it quite like that. So I'm very lucky for that, as I think anyone kind of in that same situation is, but it comes with frustrations, I guess.
But when you taste your beers, talk to me about some of those things, that you think about from a brewer's perspective of, what do you love? What is it, and what are some of those, in a brewing sense, what are some of those small levers that you start tinkering with in order to test ways of achieving some of these things that you could envision, but you're not, that you want to, kind of work on and iterate on in your beers themselves?
Yeah. I definitely at the forefront generally is bitterness, and that's not just in the IPA bitterness sense. I mean, or even hop derived bitterness for that matter. But it is just such a tenant flavor, and where it kind of shows itself can kind of make or break a beer at the end of the day. If you kind of cross that threshold, the bitter is what you're left with, and it hangs out for too long. Like, very few things are pleasant that are like that. Just ask an IPA in 2005, But
no, you're right. Human beings are conditioned to not enjoy bitter.
It's why no one eats salads. It's why they literally had to make a bumper sticker that told people to eat more kale. That's how bitter it is.
But quality of bitterness matters also significantly in beer today.
Yes, and that's. I think the quality is really quality of bitterness is really being expounded upon in a really cool way. I would take just a second to give a shout out to Scott Janish's book. I think it's called the Modern IPA or the New IPA that came out the last year. So I've been rereading that like literally in real time now, and there's just so many different channels to think about where it's like, there's more research to be done, but just when you think about, not to keep going back to the old days, but when you even think about how much really there was out there for the layman home brewer, or even layman professional brewer, to really access to think about informing processes is crazy. So the quality of bitterness, I think, for us personally, are realizing, but not really at a point to speak much on. We've figured out exactly what's happening in any way, but have just very continued to underestimate how much bitterness is coming from the dry hop in beers. And I think kettle bitterness, and to a slightly lesser degree, whirlpool bitterness, had kind of been wrangled a little bit for a while in terms of there was pretty good kind of path to follow for what's going to happen when you do X, Y, and Z.
Sure.
But the range and perception and quality of dry hop bitterness, there's just so many variables in that equation, is vast. So trying to hone down, the causations of things and roots and how that relates to ratios and contact time, and it's awesome. And then on top of that, for most people, they can't even see what's going on. Closed off tank, all just a dark shrouded mystery of even kind of what these hops look like when they're going down, or if you're recirculating, whatever it is. So really been thinking about that a ton lately. And then of course its effect with how you do things in the kettle, because they are, which that book expounds upon a lot, like very related. And then beyond that, carbonation, I think, is just a thought a lot. It's a harder lever to play with. But again, going back to the kind of more nuanced side of not just, it's easy enough to hit a consistent measured volumes of CO2 in a beer, but the finer angles of that, of how that carbonation feels from the whatever vessel you're drinking that beer out of, I think we all know, can be very wide. So that's more kind of, I guess, in mental purgatory of kind of just almost there. Unfortunately, there's no perfect great carbonation book to recommend yet.
Right.
But that's very much something that's been on my mind a lot lately.
I want to drill down a little bit into some of your, kind of hot side and whirlpool hopping, and then also into some of the dry hopping. But first, this episode is brought to you by Hopsteiner, your premium hop supplier dedicated to delivering quality hops and hop products in every package. Visit hopsteiner.com for a complete list of offerings or select shop hops to start ordering today. Also, Ska Fabricating is excited to introduce the newest player in their all-star lineup of canning line automation, the Magic Bus, a fully automatic can depalletizer with pallet management. No more pouring time and labor into the manual handling of pallets, top frames, and tier sheets on your canning line. Packaging teams can simply load cans, deband, and press start. To learn more, contact SkaFab today at 970-403-8562 or reach out online at skafabricating.com. Let's talk a little bit about that whirlpool process. From early days to now and in any kind of recent learning, how have you been playing with some of those also boil editions and then whirlpool editions to kind of explore some of the different characteristics of bitterness that you can drive through those various methods?
I think it kind of started rethinking a lot of the things that I was not on autopilot with, but getting, flirting with autopilot on, which is just, it always happens, and you need to find some way to kind of reboot yourself. And for me, this happened to be with, we did a collaboration with Trillium, and we don't do a ton of collaborations generally. Not necessarily as some stance, but just it's always fun to do them for that reason, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So it really is like, oh, new, cool.
You make it special.
I was always I was all excited about that. Been great friends with them since not long after we opened it all. And so JC, basically the idea was we were kind of going to go, Trillium would brew kind of a scaled up version of Lux, a mosaic heavy pale ale we brew, and then we were kind of going to do a slightly scaled up version of 4-point pale ale. So JC sent me the recipe, and I hit him back because I was like, there must be like a typo with how few kettle hops or whirlpool hot side hops just in general are in here. It was just a Google Drive, and he was like, no, that's it. So it was like, it's certainly still not like nothing by any stretch, but it was like half of what we had been using for years. And drinking our beers side by side, like they're clearly come from different breweries, but like ours are not twice as bitter. So that was kind of like the first thing of like, whoa. So we kind of played with bringing things down a lot, maybe in the last 4 months. But then just also still kind of not noticing maybe the perception of how the bitterness felt was varied to a degree, but the overall presence of it was not that changed. So we're very much kind of in the early stages of this, but I'm really curious about playing with ramping that actually back up almost to like, this is an incredibly like dumbed down version of what any research would explain it as, but almost kind of like snatch bitterness, potential bitterness on the hot side in a more kind of reliable way before the more confusing dry hop bitterness can kind of, a beer can only be so bitter. And I think a lot of kind of locking things in beforehand is kind of where my head's at, is focusing on how we can maximize give the whirlpool some love. I think in recent trends for how beers have gone, it's kind of been increasingly all about the dry hop. And we've seen that can make cool beers that don't really taste that different from beers that even have whirlpool hops in them. But I think I know a lot more is happening for kind of setting the stage for how that dry hop's going to hit than we previously were aware of. So I'm continuing to go down that hole. Yeah, right now.
Are you, so, to that end, all whirlpool and hot side hops are not the same. Where do you find yourself leaning towards in terms of, even in that whirlpool process, what produces a bitterness with a kind of quality that you enjoy right now?
So bitterness in general, I think, for starters, I'm a humongous proponent that a beer needs bitterness, no matter what style it is. I think in kind of just where the quote unquote like hazy IPA style has gone is just continuing to chase less and less of that. And that's all well and good for me personally. It's just not what bitterness is what makes you want to have another beer, or have another sip. And, I'm just having an Edward for the first time, that beer is so just endlessly drinkable because of the appropriate presence of bitterness on that end. It just wipe your hard drive and be ready for another Edward upload. But the quality of bitterness from the whirlpool, that's tough. I will say that we used to not, we've pretty much always done a 30-minute stand between flame out and then beginning knockout, even from when we scaled up our size system. And then, I don't know, 3 or so years ago, we started without chilling. And then 3 or so years ago, we started running through the HeatX first to get into 185, 190.
Yeah.
The beers, sensory-wise, we felt more inclined to them. Not dramatically so, and maybe it was just we're only now getting to the point where we have even a remotely legit like sensory program, like a true program. I mean, we've always been doing it, but very informally.
Sure.
But we had chilling, pre-chilling, and then not pre-chilling samples analyzed, and the pre-chilled beer actually had more measured IBUs, even though it would just kind of go against everything you would normally, and that could have, and there's many reasons, I suppose, I'm sure, because there's a lot going on every time, in every beer, but the beers that got the pre-chilling were actually like more bitter measured.
Yeah.
So to be completely honest, in a lot of ways, we kind of just let that sleeping dog lie at that point. Cause it was like, well, everything we could read says this isn't going to happen. Like, yeah, it follows the logic that the beer would be, that we would, the drink of the beer would be better, but the part about like the scientific part, like that makes no sense. So I feel like this is going to be kind of a fool's errand to try to like prove more with this or whatever. But recently we, shout out to your sponsor, Hopsteiner. We actually did a collaboration beer with them for the main Brewers Summit. And that was the first time we had used some of their hop products. I wasn't there for the brew day. I had to be up here. But it was pretty much like a bitterless kind of aroma extract. And we also had regular hops in the beer as well. And the bitterness overall wasn't tremendously different from a normal beer of ours, I guess. But the perception of the aroma and mouthfeel was really, it was the most orange-like beer that I've ever touched. It didn't translate fully to the packaged product, but taking off the tank, I could not figure it out. It was very very approachable and nice, but just the intensity of this one directional flavor kind of floored me. So that definitely got me interested in dabbling more in that world. For the longest time, it was kind of just like, all right, the only thing you can get is the bittering extract, we're adding like a half pound of Apollo for a 20 barrel batch for our bittering charge. Like, so what, we're going to get a pipette to add this tar instead. Like, that's only going to add more time for us. We'll skip that. So I'd kind of written it off. So now with this new, and we never played a ton with cryo. We have, but it's always kind of been the feeling of the benefit isn't worth pursuing that. We can use them and feel comfortable with it, but unless for very variety specific, and even that's mostly anecdotal about where that form suits the variety better. Like Equinox, kind of the one that we do try to use cryo version of.
Oh yeah,
but it's for just a little bit. In my head, it's kind of a green pepper hedge that hop can bring.
And so the cryo form, because there's less vegetal matter, seems to not pull that flavor out as much.
That seems to be kind of just our very loose experience. It's part of a dry hop in a beer that has a bunch of other three other hops in it, so it's hard to really point the exact finger at what's going on. But we have on the whole been relatively conservative in that way of playing with too many things, because to be honest, until recently, in my head it was just all about the dry hop and how you can manipulate that. And I think obviously that's still a huge part of everything and how that finished beer is, but I'm kind of realizing, going back to the understanding that it really is a matrix of all these different components of the process, not just dominated by one, I think.
I want to talk about that a little bit more, but first, this episode is brought to you by Brewers Publications, publishers of Historical Brewing Techniques, The Lost Art of Farmhouse Brewing by Lars Marius Garshall. Equal parts history, cultural anthropology, social science, and travelogue. Historical Brewing Techniques describes Northern European farmhouse brewing and fermentation methods that are vastly different from modern craft brewing. Order your copy of Historical Brewing Techniques today at brewerspublications.com. Also, Craft Beer and Brewing's All Access subscriptions give you a year of the print and digital editions of the magazine, plus access to our library of video courses, a special deep dive email only for All Access subscribers, premium content, and All Access exclusive merchandise. Go to beerandbrewing.com and click on the subscribe button to join now. As a subscriber to the magazine, you always get to see it first because we release the digital edition of the magazine on our various apps about a week or two sometimes before those mailed copies get to folks. So if you want to be the first, that is the way to do it. Beerandbrewing.com for that. I want to talk a little bit, we've talked a little bit now about Whirlpool, but let's talk a little bit about your dry hopping process. And I'd also like to pick your brain on hops blending and how you go about thinking about that, just because it's the hardest thing for any brewer to articulate for me. And so I'd love to put everyone on the spot to try to, put these kinds of, flavor pieces into words and understand how you think about those combinations. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about that dry hopping process for you. Obviously you guys are using an expressive yeast, as the Alvarado guys might say, something I don't know exactly what that is or whether you're public about it, but do you engage in kind of mid-fermentation dry hopping? Are you looking for that kind of biotransformation process? Talk to me a little bit about how you go about dry hopping your beers.
In general, for just our hops in all ways, we've kind of been structured by limitation in a lot of ways. When we opened, hop contracting was kind of at its tightest,
right,
which I definitely didn't plan for, and that's one of the many reasons why you should probably work at a brewery before you try to open one. So there was kind of, we only had X, Y, and Z varieties we could pull from, unless we wanted to pay absurd rates on spot, which also the spot market was totally different back. Everything was different, hop wise. So I think we do have a relatively methodical view of blending. methodical in the point of less is more, or at least there's a much higher chance you could really understand how these are all interacting if you're not throwing too many spices, in the chili. Chili's probably actually the worst analogy for that, because apparently how to make good chilies to do that. So let's leave chili out of this. But like none of our other than substance, which was very much driven by constraint. None of our beers have more than 4 varieties of hops in them, and most are 3. Is kind of like where most of them end up. And again, going back to kind of what we talked about earlier, even then, I still feel like I don't have, the blueprint of really what is going on. I don't have a whole lot to say on that, other than it's very much a results-driven thing of we really like this. We'll tinker a lot here and there, but again, in pretty conservative ways. Where I think a lot of the variety of a lot of breweries comes from, especially on the hoppy side of things, is really trying to get down and dirty with some of that. And I think that's kind of because haven't really went that path. It's tough to have a forum to really like not throw everything at the board, but really just play around with the canvas a lot to really kind of try to develop a deeper understanding of kind of that other layer, that next level of what's going on there. So I think we're always looking for those things, but without being kind of willing to, our desire to want to try to perfect existing things, I think still overrides that but that is something lost, I think, in going one way versus another's. Wouldn't be my strong suit to definitively draw any conclusions.
So you all are large enough to select now. How have you defined for yourself what you're looking for in some of these hops varieties that make up the kind of core of some of the beers that you make?
It's hard because, again, from early on, there was no way we weren't going to get varieties from a bunch of different places in a lot of the cases. So we kind of had to have this just reliance that on the supply. Part of it was ignorance, but also just a reliance on the seller that there's kind of an aggregate for what Centennial is. That's an industry standard for what Apollo is or what have you. So going to selections really opened up my eyes for how goddamn different, 4 Simcoes can be.
Yeah.
That are all grown by, high level professional farms that do this literally for a living. So kind of with just that like initial shock of like, whoa, we've definitely been, when we're doing that, we really kind of want the platonic ideal of what a Simcoe is, not the most robust one or most, loudest one, or even necessarily the best quote unquote one, but what Simcoe should be when it's good. And that's obviously, I don't know why I'm spending so much time on Simcoe, but that one in particular was one that was just like, what? Like this is all really? Where some like really were very, if you told me it was Mosaic, I wouldn't have blinked an eye. And then others in different lots were very much more subdued, kind of, had a little bit of that just kind of kiss of stone fruit, but was much more on the piney, kind of more subtle side. So yeah, it was. So that will be definitely something that is increasingly important, I think, as we go on, which I think you've seen a lot of breweries kind of refocus on that.
For sure.
Yeah. So Yeah, I guess that's all. Just it sucks that you can only do it once a year. That's for sure. So, but the one again of the drawbacks of kind of trying to maximize your buying power or whatever, and your ability to select more varieties, is having to shift a lot of your business into single streams, or at least fewer streams.
Right.
Which over 6 years, we've got hops from a lot of places. So if something bad happens in one, it's a safety net, really. And throughout that process, you establish good relationships with each one of them. So that's been tough to navigate it. You can navigate it, but that's been the only kind of shitty part about that. But it does hold a lot of future benefit. I'm really excited about.
From a kind of personal hop fanatic standpoint, and I'll define you as that. I don't know if you define yourself as that.
Please.
Are there things that you've smelled or rubbed, in the last year that have particularly excited you or sparked some ideas in your brewing mind?
To be honest, not that there isn't hops out there, but on this last run out there wasn't anything that I kind of literally wrote home about personally. I think part of that is a little bit of fatigue. Not that I don't want more varieties as a brewer, but a slight fatigue of just how different can each one be. There's starting to be a degree of sameness. I'm sure growers are far more aware of that than I am, and are, growing to avoid that. And I'm sure they really are, but and the other kind of side to that is going back to like how few contracts we were able to have for so long. Like this is the first year our Nelson contract came through. So for me, Nelson's might as well be HBC, whatever, because it's practically brand new to me. So that's been really exciting. Sabro's definitely, obviously, a lot more new than Nelson, but is a very, very interesting hop. And going back to Hopsteiner, we've continued to use more and more Sultana, which is one of their kind of relatively newer experimental varieties. Kind of has what a lot of Hopsteiner hops have, is much bigger alpha profile, but hopefully if a hop's growing well, you should probably get a much bigger oil profile with that as well. And when that hop's good, that's the most pineapple hop I've ever come across, for sure.
It is an interesting challenge, for IPA brewers today to kind of build that diversity. And I love, obviously, I'm a huge Nelson fan. I shouldn't say obviously. I am a huge Nelson fan and loves, Southern Hemisphere hops because they get weird. Talk to me a little bit about how you balance that kind of pleasure of the fun, big, bright, sweet fruit notes with some of these edges within those flavors, to kind of add that little bit of, first cleansing bitterness, as we talked about before, but also, that intriguing funk that keeps it from being just this piece of obvious sweet fruitiness.
I think substance, to be honest, really, that's kind of like, in a nutshell, what that beer kind of is built on, and still strives to be, going away from New Zealand hops. But that beer's about 30% Falconer's Flight, which is a blend of a bunch of C hops, pretty much, that hops at Hop Union, Yakima Chief puts together. 30% Centennial, and then the rest pretty much an equal blend of just a little bit of Simcoe, a little bit of Chinook, and a little bit of Apollo. The varieties in it have a few of the smaller quantity varieties have shifted here and there over time, but more or less the skeleton of the beer hasn't changed that much since we opened in terms of the spirit of it. And I mean, if you've ever even come close to Apollo, you don't need more than 5% into a hop bill to get exactly some of that oniony locker room character. Just like, a little too much, fresh bag of weed in your face, maybe you could say. But it's when done in kind of a nuanced way, it adds exactly what you're talking about, just this other layer, just this kind of like place you can go if you want to in a beer that keeps it interesting, keeps the whole thing interesting. If I was given a massive contract for Citra or something and said that this is lifetime, 3 or 4 years ago, we probably would have added, a more reliably, straight fruit hop into that mix, but it just wasn't really on the table for us then. And now we kind of, if nothing else, that beer kind of provided an example for us for like, okay, I like this because of this. So I think that's influenced a lot of things going forward where really exactly what you're talking about. Like, we've never just shot for juice. And that's been, I can completely comprehend why those are about as crowd pleasing of a type of IPA as you could possibly produce. And we've just never shot for exactly that, because of just, I think, kind of just trying to play a long game, I guess, is when we do talk about, okay, we should bring more beers in, or we should, whatever, Pete and I talk about. There's a recurring kind of theme of like a shared feeling of what it always comes down to a long game to some degree. And us wanting to do this for our life. I mean, I sure as hell know, like, even after, 6 years, like, I literally can't even fathom doing anything else but this. So there's, I guess you tell yourself you're making these short-term sacrifices to be more, stable or agile or steady in the future, even though you're kind of kidding yourself because you have no idea what a future is going to look like. This, obviously, we're living an example of, you never know what tomorrow is going to bring. But, yeah, I think I got off track there a little bit, but sorry.
That's okay. We've talked a lot about hoppy beers, but I know, you're talking to me from your Milo main location, where your little studio is across the street from this brewery that you all have built as a kind of a labor of love to make wild and some sour beers, which is kind of a passion project. Obviously, a small part of overall production, maybe even not a great commercial idea at the root of it. But not everything that we do is purely driven by the commercial possibility of it. Some of it is driven because you see the creative potential and you want to go after it. Talk to me a little bit about envisioning a wild program. Obviously, there's some other fantastic breweries making similar styles of beer. Oxbow in Maine is just such a phenomenal producer of that kind of style. Talk to me a little bit about how you have carved out a vision for what you want to make in this kind of wild sour mixed culture space, and some of the first forays that you've made into it.
Yeah, I think in terms of the other really great producers of these types of beers in the state, you're completely right. And I think
I should have also mentioned Allagash, because obviously with their spontaneous and sour beer program, they've really set a bar for what they do, and it would be remiss to not mention them in that.
Kind of like what we were talking about earlier about having something to add to the conversation in a category within the place you're trying to make it. I think if nothing else, you can look back with the hoppy stuff and be like, okay, there was a place for us, or at least there continues to be now. I mean, who knows if there will be tomorrow, but certainly continues to be a space for us to occupy and develop now. And I think even despite how, like, truly Allagash and Oxbow are literally some of the best producers of a handful. I mean, there's no one that's going to argue with you that white is not the best whip beer in the States. And I mean, both Resurgam, obviously with the foresight of literally like bringing this idea to America, honestly, that you can do this well, is obviously amazing. Just I'm like the variants, but straight Resurgam is one of my favorite beers, period.
I agree.
And then honestly, Oxford Native Wild is on par. It's very much a different beer, but very much same category and level. But it just felt like there was, from a beer, from the beer side of things, definitely, more we could just add, because it's us doing it, not someone else. And the other part was really being inspired by an increasing number of breweries all over the country. I mean, it was kind of how breweries always operated, hundreds of years ago, but was just being really a adding value to their rural area. This Milo's like not even 2,000 people now. It's in the poorest county in Maine, and if you haven't spent a lot of time in Maine, it's hard to overstate like how centralized in the South the state's population is. I mean, outside of like the bottom third of the state is like, I think, well over half of the population, and then there's a lot of green north from that, and accordingly, just there's not a lot of reason to come to Milo. And so that was when we did talk about, when I certainly had the itch to want to, like pretty much any brewer does, if they didn't start out doing that, everything kind of ends with mixed fermentation in terms of just the whatever that brewing mountain you're climbing. It seems like that's pretty much a recurring theme, is it ends with you get there eventually one way or another. So I was very much in that zone, but there was never going to be a clear way to implement that into the space we had in Portland. And then even though it's 2.5 hours away, like when Pete and I talked about it, we never even considered doing it somewhere closer. It was either Milo or we weren't doing it. Neither of us can still really explain why we were so set on that and why that train of thought. But so to add something of value, just a part of the state that needed it, and that's not in a look at what we're doing at all. It felt right. Peter says that a lot, and it felt like really the only way to go. And here we are, and it still feels that way.
So talk to me a little bit about building a kind of culture and approach to these mixed fermentation beers,
Very much still in the process of all of that. I was always too impatient as a home brewer to want to play around with mixed culture stuff a lot. Anytime I could get a lambic or goose or really just any mixed fermentation beer, I loved that world, but literally was just straight up too impatient to play around too much. So, and again, like I said, kind of all roads lead back to, the Rome that is, mixed fermentation, I think, for almost every brewer I know. And it's just so different from what I've been doing for the last X amount of years, and still am, but just is. So honestly, like at the beginning, it was like we at least had our original system, our 10-barrel system we had kind of put in storage for something. We didn't really know what, and then this is where it ended up. So at least there wasn't that variable to figure out, but we're really just brewing things and filling oak and kind of different, blends of, yeast and bacteria kind of ratios, and playing around with ratios. And basically I did that way too much because suddenly there was too many, colors in the palette of like it. And it's like, oh, I have to manage all this, don't I? So we definitely like learned the hard way about kind of trying to throw too much at the wall, and inevitably beers are going to get forgotten. So I think that was kind of the hardest lesson of like realizing over the first 2 years or so, like how much beers, maybe they were never going to be great, but who knows what percentage were at a certain point and then just neglected and then, for too long. And so there's just been very much more focus on that. And yeah, it's very blending heavy up here, kind of for the same reasons. Right. I was listening to your interview with John Laffler on the drive up here today, and hearing him talk about how, they had kind of this sacred carboy where the culture was. And it was like, man, I think we're almost accidentally developing kind of a culture up here of just, you follow what works and kind of keep pursuing that. You refill that tank soonest, or you disperse that barrel into whatever to use as inoculant.
Right.
If you're liking what it is, that obviously is a internal conflict of like, oh, it tastes pretty fucking good as it is. Like, kind of sucks to, throw it into this for another fingers crossed thing. And then just the uncertainty of how much these beers change, like whether that, like, you feel like you have forever when you're talking about forgetting them. It feels like it could never go past the point where you catch it and you're like, okay, I watched you on your ascent and now you've plateaued in a place. We need to grab you now. Because of how vastly different the timeline is from doing 3-week hoppy beers. So it just feels like you have literally all the time in the world, but then how you can just suddenly 2 years, I mean, sitting here talking to you 2.5 years down the line. So I'd very much like to have a little more, honestly feel like I have more control of what's going on up here. Cause as these, and then in the bottle, as a beer develops, like that's an entirely new world in terms of the existence of, drink this as fresh as, maybe not as fresh as possible. I'm also not that guy, but this has a shelf life, a very defined shelf life, and it's a shame to not be able to enjoy it within that. Where these beers, some of them very much do have that. Others, when you grab a bottle of Goose and see a 25-year Best Buy, it's like, yeah, they probably have the if you've ever been to Cantillon or Treefontaine, like there's beers well over 25 years there. They probably have evidence that it holds up to that, but you have just no idea with most mixed fermentation beers, which is fun, exciting, and exhilarating, and kind of the chase. But at the same time, it's just kind of like, I feel that way more than I'd like to. I don't know.
Understandable. So, the way we typically close the podcast is talking about what success looks like. And so for you at Bissell Brothers, obviously these are weird times to even have that conversation about success, because most breweries are just trying to figure out how to get through it. But I think that, even at this point, looking to the future, what would you define success as for Bissell Brothers, and how will you know when you've eventually achieved it?
I think about that a lot. Like, I think probably most people that you ask that question to do. But when I look at what kind of I anticipate will be the time when I feel like, okay, cool. Like any type of mental milestone you make for yourself, time and time again, it never brings the satisfaction you're really looking for or think you're going to be, gifted. But I think looking back over that same period of time, I'm learning more and more that what satisfies me the most is the satisfaction of the crew of people that work at our brewery. I mean, it can be so easy to take for granted a good group of people that are reliable, are smart, are fun, that you want to be better because of, and vice versa. Because it feels so good and natural that it can definitely it can be easy to forget that not everyone is able to work with people like we're able to work with, and taking steps to try to, whether that's different types of insurance or increasing time off, or just whatever that may be. I think have always been a very good employer, but for a long time it was very unstructured. It was very kind of there was so few of us that it was like, well, there was not really a concern that no one was not pulling their share. I mean, we're all in basically one room, and but as things have gotten bigger, just make life now, because we can make life better and more structured for everyone, and a place that we've been very fortunate to have extremely low turnover, but that obviously gets harder each day, and to strive to maintain that clip as much as we possibly can. Really, when you do actually step back and see that is probably what success is, but it's not a locked in thing. it's yeah.
There's that people element to it that I can really respect, that, you know, there's the accolades and the consumer adoration, and that's one piece of it. But, you know, for those of us that come at business from a creative perspective, oftentimes I do hear it more often than not that getting that piece of the puzzle down and making sure that the business is also working for the people that are making the business work, it is such a cool and important piece of the overall equation. Nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Old Orchard invites you to step up your fruit game. Hopsteiner is your premium supplier for quality hops and hops products. Ska Fabricating invites you to take a ride on the Magic Bus. Historical Brewing Techniques, the lost art of farmhouse brewing, is out now from Brewers Publications. And Craft Beer and Brewing's all-access subscriptions are the best way to support this very podcast. Noah Bissell, if people want to learn more about Bissell Brothers and what you do, podcasts, etc., where do they find you all?
Just Bissell Brothers, .com and Bissell Brothers, or at Bissell Brothers for Instagram, are kind of the main channels.
Yeah.
And then Matt and I, the general manager up here in Milo, do a podcast together every week called Craning In. It's beer focused, but kind of loosely so.
Sure. Well, thanks for joining me on the podcast. And I've enjoyed this remote conversation. I can't wait to get back up to Maine and have a pint in person sometime soon. Cheers.
Thanks, man.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.